Welcome and thank you for joining the Cranbrook Fiber Department for Camille Ann Brewer's lecture this lovely afternoon. Ms. Brewer began as curator of contemporary art, a newly created position at the George Washington University Museum and the Textile Museum in fall of 2016. Prior to coming to George Washington University, Ms. Brewer was executive director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, a Chicago-based membership association of libraries, universities, and other archival institutions based at the University of Chicago. Between 1999 and 2014, Brewer operated her own fine art consulting business, CAB Fine Art Limited. Her clients included Jane Addams Hull House in Chicago, the Mott Warsh Collection, the Romare Bearden Foundation, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan, and the Detroit Children's Museum. Brewer earned her undergraduate degree from the California College of the Arts, her MFA from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and her Master in Library and Information Sciences from Valdosta State University. Brewer has also been an active hand weaver for over 30 years. Please help me welcome Ms. Brewer.
Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction and for being such a gracious host. Thank you so much. I also want to thank Mark Newport for the invitation to come to Cranbrook Art Academy. And I want to thank all the students also that I've seen over the last 2 days. I hope that I was able to give you some information to help grow your practice and think about the work that you want to do in the future. And I also learned from all of you. It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. I would like to dedicate this talk this evening to Zoe Irons. Today is her first birthday. So I want to start with Desus and Mero. How many people are aware of Desus and Mero? One? This is the #1 rated late night television show in the United States. More viewers than Jimmy Kimmel, more viewers than Jimmy Fallon and Stephen Colbert. They're from, I've got my cane here, let me set this here. They're from the Bronx, and they give you the news from the Bronx, the Bodega Boys, and they travel to Miami from Miami Basel. I saw the van go by, and I was like, oh, I want to see them. I just love these two. So I'm going to do quite a few Instagram slides through the presentation. And for many of you, you understand and know Instagram. Many of you don't know and understand Instagram. And I'll talk more about Instagram later. But I'm just going to point out just the real estate of the screen in Instagram. So we've got Instagram. This is the account name. Many people put the location where they're at when they snap the picture. And this here records the interaction and engagement with viewers of Instagram. So they say, we're here at Art Basel. We're also trying to figure out how to monetize garbage and call it art. They give you the real deal from the Bronx perspective. And I want to meet them next year in Miami. So I said untitled because I'm talking about 3 different subjects tonight, 3 distinct topics. First one being Detroit, Michigan. Second one, sustainability and creative textile reuse. And the last one is Instagram, Art World Textiles, Textiles Art World. So I'm just going to give a brief background on my travels through the United States. I'm from Los Angeles, California, moved to the Bay Area when I turned 21, lived in the Bay Area 10 years, moved to Ann Arbor to go to graduate school at the University of Michigan, and someone here in town convinced me to stay, which was a good decision professionally and personally. Left Detroit, I got tired of the cold winters and moved to Florida, was there 2 years and moved to Atlanta for 6. Left Atlanta and moved to Manhattan, New York for 3, Chicago for 3, and now I'm in DC. I say all that to just point out I've lived in many different communities and seen art from a variety of perspectives. I came to Detroit and I didn't know anyone. And once I got hooked up into the network, Detroit embraced me. And many of you I met, when I arrived in 1995. And I'm so thankful. My daughter had a great high school experience and has returned to Detroit. She and her husband just bought a home there, and we'll be moving back to Detroit next month. So as I read articles about Detroit's redevelopment, and read this and read that and renew, and there's just, how do I say, it's the articles and news stories that I see present Detroit as a blank slate, as if nothing existed there before the newcomers showed up. And there's this constant refrain, and it generally runs like this. People say, I like Detroit and all the people I've met here. The city seems to be building momentum in terms of turning things around. The city is a blank slate with cheap, affordable living and studio space. There's an art scene that seems to be developing as well. I meet artists all the time, and many have come from New York. Unfortunately, the majority of these newcomers lack little, if any, curiosity about the rich history of the visual art community before they arrived. When looking at the history, newcomers appear to celebrate old Detroit from the 1910s and 1920s during the early stages of the automobile manufacturing industry in the city. These newcomers look over and look past the city's longtime Black majority, which has built a rich visual culture in Detroit since the 1920s. No other museum in this country can say this. 81 years of engagement with the children of Detroit. You might see a museum, we've had our 25th annual school show, our 35th annual school show, but 80 years, 8 decades of engagement with children. Those children, and I've been to the ceremonies, they receive their awards in front of the Diego Rivera murals with their parents. Everybody's dressed up. 20 years, 25 years later, those children are standing with their kids in front of the Diego Rivera murals to earn their awards. 20, 25 years later, grandpa, dad, and child are standing there together, that there's this long-term engagement. I talk to Detroiters across the country, in Atlanta, in Washington. There's a woman that I know who grew up here, and they talk about going to the library on Woodward, and after you finished your studies, you went across the street to the museum, that was a part of your weekly experience. So to these newcomers, I have a response for them. And my response is Elizabeth Youngblood, Shirley Woodson, Walter Williams, Michael Kelly Williams, Larry Walker. This is Kara Walker's father, graduate of Wayne State University. Chris Turner, Robert Stahl, Gilda Snowden, Dwight Smith, Karen Sanders, Bill Sanders, Senghor Reed, Jocelyn Rainey, Ibn Pitts, Sabrina Nelson, Maceo Mitchell, Chaz Miller, Allie McGee, Charles McGee. Hubert Massey. Philip Martin, sorry this is skewed. It's the only image I could find of his. Al Loving, these are all Detroiters. And Detroit is not a blank slate. John Lockhart, Huey Lee Smith, Lester Johnson, Al Hinton, Carol Harris, Ernest Hartman, Leroy Foster, Valerie Fair. Again, Detroit is not a blank slate. Hugh Granum, this is in the collection of the Detroit Institute of Arts. Tyree Guyton, Cephal Gardner, Clayton Dowdell, Walter Davis, Donald Calloway, Gigi Bolden, MacArthur Benyon, Richard Bennett, Anita Bates, Jadi, Ajay, Jide, So to sit and read news in New York or read news in DC, Atlanta, and it's just disconcerting to know that there's a community that supported me and supported my family and welcomed my family that's still very active. And this is not necessarily African Americans collecting African American art. It's collectors collecting work by African American artists from Detroit. Richard Manoogian's collecting, Marianne Mott's collecting, Larry Deitch is collecting. So the engagement that I saw here, I don't see in Atlanta. I don't see in Washington, D.C. I don't see the same level of engagement. Even in New York. New York's the market, you go to buy, you go to look. But in terms of the relationship between artists and collectors and the museum and an 80-year engagement with the major museum, that is unique to Detroit. And so I say to those who write these articles, do it until you get it right, from native Detroiter Aretha Franklin. Please get the story right. I think everyone would have a richer experience if that were the case. And there are a few other people that I couldn't find images for, and many, many, many more. There are people here also tonight who are active in the Detroit artist community that I haven't noted. I apologize to you. Sustainability and creative reuse. Apparel industry professionals say that about 15 to 20% of the fabric used to produce clothing winds up in the nation's landfill because it's cheaper to dump scraps than to recycle them. This is a major problem. And I'm seeing more and more people who work with textiles address these issues. Each day, truckloads of textiles and clothing are dumped into mountainous landfills, and despite most of these textiles being recyclable, the real problem is that you've got the H&Ms and the Forever 21s of the world producing this cheap clothing, and folks go in and buy a t-shirt and wear it once or twice and dispose of it. The District of Columbia spends about $250,000 a year just to dispose of textiles. There's 30% of the waste out of the public housing projects in the District of Columbia are textiles. So how do we change consumer behavior and thinking about textile waste? And as I state here, the textile and fashion industries combined are the second largest polluters in the world. Tons and tons of textiles are going into the landfill. Americans throw away anywhere between 65 and 75 pounds of clothing a year. We send bags of clothing to the Goodwill. About 10% is sold in the store, 90% is bundled up and shipped overseas to places like Kenya, to places like Namibia, to places like maybe Guatemala, Central America. And we need to understand the true cost of this, the labor cost and the environmental cost of our use of textiles. This is Carol Long. She's also known as Full Fiber, and she's attempting to call attention to abuses of the global garment manufacturing industry, and also looking at sweatshop conditions around the world. She asks us to buy less, to buy better, to mend and reuse whenever possible. Her motto is stop shopping and start sewing. She teaches people to make and repair their own clothes instead of buying and discarding garments produced under these exploitive conditions. I met Carol in Los Angeles in February. She set up a performance space in the Los Angeles Convention Center during the College Art Association meeting. And this is here. She carries patterns with her and fabric, a sewing machine, and invites people to sit down and mend their clothes, to become active in the repair and the longevity of their textiles. Just recently, we have got Instagram slide here, Earth Day Zero Waste Weaving with an action in Union Square, maybe 2 weeks ago, where this organization set up warped frame looms in the square and invited people to take scrap textiles as weft and weave cloth on the square. Textiles are so ubiquitous to who we are as human beings, and to engage the children and people from all over, there's something very satisfying about the up and down, in and out, and creating cloth. And for young people to understand how cloth is produced and made, I think is very important. I like to go to bookstores and flip through fine art magazines, and it was interesting to see in Frieze in February an article on this very issue. So this is leaking in or creeping into the fine art discussion, this waste of clothing and what happens to all this material. It doesn't dissolve. This is solid waste that just hangs out in the landfill. And fibers such as blends, cotton blends with polyester, those are very difficult to contend with, because how do you unravel the polyester from the cotton? And it's just a difficult puzzle for engineers, textile engineers, to confront. So a lot of that fabric and material goes into the landfill. Based in Florence, Alabama, a former t-shirt manufacturing, pretty much the capital. They made more t-shirts in Florence than they did in other places in the United States. A woman by the name of Nicole Channing. Her business is called Alabama Channing. She creates hand-sewn garments made from discarded cotton jersey t-shirts. The company's dedicated to the craft of locally sewn garments and goods, both hand and machine sewn. They maintain responsible, ethical, and sustainable practices. The makers strive in their work to elevate and merge design, craft, and fashion. The company's goal is to preserve traditions of community, design, producing, and living arts by examining work and life through the acts of storytelling, placemaking, and hand production. Mandisa Smith, and she's here, I see her, is building felted clothing around the body, so fabric is not cut, there's no fallout. I don't know how many of you know how to sew, but when you cut out patterns, there's this scrap fabric, this space between pattern pieces that's not usable after you make your cuts, and that's tossed away. And Mandisa works around that by felting and forming the garment on the body. And then we have Teemo Wrists, who's the Associated Dean of School of Construction Environments at Parsons, and he's developed this zero waste cutting where they work around the waste that happens on the cutting floor, that 15 to 20% of waste. He's looking at how do I design a garment where every cut is meaningful, that there's no fabric thrown away as I produce the garment. So as you can see here, your two bodice pieces, and that fabric in between the two pieces, you can't use that unless you're using it for stuffing of a pillow or something of that sort. It usually gets tossed away and then again ends up in the landfill. So this way of thinking about how to design clothing, I find very intriguing, especially for hand weavers that want to produce cloth for clothing. You're not throwing away your hand-woven cloth, that you can produce the garment using all of the cloth in the yardage. There are also fine artists. We have Manish Nye, who grew up in a family of textile merchants in India, grew up around design and different textures, and he uses a variety of media to create his sculpture, mostly using these discarded fabrics. He's interested in discarded fabric, textiles, cardboard, paper, etc. And I also like to point out that this is a major gallery in Chicago, and that this art world, or as Chuck Close told me, the art market, is embracing this idea of this reuse. This is not a fad. This is not going away. As we move forward, young people are going to continue to engage in this thinking. Nari Warne lives and works in New York. His sculptural installations are composed of collected materials from his Harlem neighborhood, and his work examines race, poverty, and consumer culture. We talked at length about this piece and how he wanted to create this drop-down cord or rope from this structure that's lifted off the floor. In New York, especially in Harlem, the police have these, I don't even know what they're called, this apparatus where an officer sits in this little room and observes all that's going on in the street. Pedestrians on the street, you can't see into that space, so you're spied on by the police department, and they're scattered all over Harlem and Brooklyn. And so he used discarded textiles to come down and create this ring on the floor. Another piece from the show. Sorry, these are slides I took at the opening, but using, again, the discarded textiles to build his work. Shaniqua Smith. Her work is composed entirely of found material. This piece in particular, in the Denver Art Museum collection, involves more than 110 cubic feet of bundled fabric, mostly clothing, and this is arranged in this gradation from black to white. She's fascinated with the ever-increasing velocity of American consumption. I'm sorry, oh, you've got it, I can't see it here. And Brent Lawton, which I'm really fascinated with. He is working between Berlin and Vancouver. I discovered his work for the first time in Art Form magazine. And I thought, who is this weaver that I don't see in American Craft or Surface Design magazine? And these woven paintings, he uses the term paintings, he doesn't define himself as a weaver, are constructed of secondhand fibers, including wool, cotton, and acrylic to create his geometric designs. Using recycled fibers, Lawton begins his work by sorting the textiles into piles to see what materials might work together, and he wants to just estimate how much color he has, and then builds his composition based on the materials he has available. He uses a rudimentary drawing as a color reference for color placement, but the nature of the pre-used material creates a variety of lines and textures. He presents his work as paintings deliberately. His weavings are stretched over canvas, which are then mounted onto stretcher bars. Just to clarify, he says, there is no paint used. Acrylic is often listed as the material in his work because he uses synthetic yarns and fabrics. Instagram, art world, textiles, art world. I'm going to come back to Brent Lawton in this section. I want to recite a poem before going into this section because I think there's a major paradigm shift happening in the discussion around fiber art and the art world, what young people are thinking about, what the older generation feel the younger people should do, and this poem is a response to that. Your children are not your children. They're the sons and daughters of life yearning for itself. They come through you, but they are not from you. And though they are with you, they belong not to you. You can give them your love, but not your thoughts. They have their own thoughts. You can house their bodies, but not their souls. For their souls dwell in a place called tomorrow, which you cannot visit in your dreams. You can strive to be like them, but you cannot make them just like you. You cannot make them just like you. This is their world. So New Year's 2017, I'm with my daughter and son-in-law. The game's on the big screen television in the living room. My son-in-law played football for Michigan, so the football game's always on every TV in the house. And both of them are sitting there on the sofa doing this. And I said, whoa, wait a second. You all make really good money, the two of you. They do. They just bought a mansion in Indian Village. How do I get your attention? I need you to be a patron at my museum. How do I get your attention? So my daughter says, come here, Mom, I'll show you. I said, ooh, Instagram, wow. This is heavy. I mean, that's, certain people want to dismiss social media, and then I fall into Instagram and say, this is a powerful tool. Not necessarily to promote yourself or to post, this is what I'm about and I'm doing this, but to glean information from me as a curator of contemporary art, because the contemporary discussion is happening in social media. So we have a cadre of artists among this new wave of contemporary artists exploring crafts in innovative ways, and they're producing conceptual work that breaks away from the conventions associated with craft by bringing it into a global contemporary art context. These artists explore new visual forms that examine tradition and challenge our perception of traditions through iconic cultural objects and craft forms. So I get onto Instagram and I'm looking for contemporary, quote unquote, fiber or textile artists, and I run into Jessica Tang. And she does these wonderful embroidered pieces, and what she does on Instagram is she shows the progress of her work as she's building her pieces. She has almost 38,000 followers on Instagram. That's pretty amazing for an individual artist. Most institutions would love to have that kind of following. What's nice about Instagram also is I can reach out directly to artists. So I reached out to Jessica. I said, hey, we're doing this ethnic Chinese show at the Textile Museum. It would look embroidery. It would be great to bring you in. And she responds to me back. She's very shy and she doesn't like public speaking, so she declined. But I can have this dialogue with her immediately. I don't have to go search for her phone number. I don't have to go look for her email address. She's right there and available. And she's well known for these pinups where she does Japanese patterning on the body, on the human form. Look at her engagement. 3,100 likes, 2,100 likes. And I'm thinking, this is engagement in social media space. What would happen in a gallery, a museum space, if people knew her work was there and that you could drive traffic through social media into the galleries? A year ago at this time, the Textile Museum mounted a show called Inspiring Beauty, 50 Years of Ebony Fashion Fair. So I had just learned some of the magic of Instagram, and I started promoting the show on Instagram. So about 2 or 3 weeks into the show, NPR shows up, Channel 4 News shows up. And I said, well, why are you here? They said, you're trending on social media. So print and television's following this. Amazing. Artists I never heard of. Terry Friedman, that's clearly weaving. Major engagement. And this is Art Forum posting this. Again, I don't see these artists in American Craft. I don't see them in Surface Design Journal. So this kind of this bypass saying, well, yeah, I'm weaving and I'm working in textiles, but I'm not going to place myself in that sphere. I'm going to go play in the bigger playground and engage a larger audience. Artsy, 44,000 likes, and here's this young woman working on a knitting machine in the gallery and hanging these pieces of yardage from the ceiling. That young people are engaged in this. We can't say, well, the young people are not interested in what we're doing at the museum. They are. We're just in the wrong space to capture them. Art and Practice, which is a new alternative space in Los Angeles featuring Shaniqua Smith. We've got Art Forum, 5,100 likes for this crocheted work of Police Don't Cross tape that's been worked into this sculptural form hanging from the ceiling. Again, how do I get this attention into my institution? So I follow Sonia Clark on Instagram, and she did an interesting video where her work was featured in Sculpture magazine. Again, not American Craft. Again, not Surface Design Journal. And she flips through, and you can see the engagement she has on this. And she's sharing her 8-page spread in Sculpture magazine, that she's having a dialogue with sculptors across the country or people interested in sculpture, not necessarily fiber art or textile art, but a broader audience. So when I was in graduate school at the University of Michigan, I developed a practice of just going into the bookstore in the periodical section once a month and just opening art magazines and looking at the table of contents first and reading that. Not necessarily reading the article, but what is the zeitgeist happening this month? What's happening? So I'm flipping through Art Forum, February of this year, and I see knitting, full-page ad in the first 12 pages. That's expensive real estate in Art Forum. Who is this person? Never heard of them. Look up on Instagram. And again, this engagement. I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I like the work. I don't like the work. I think it's important. I don't think it's important. I'm interested in the vehicle on how artists, galleries, museums are communicating to a new audience. I picked up art form. Elizabeth Catlett's on the cover. Hey, let me go get that. I run to the bookstore, buy it, and I'm flipping through. Who is Channing Hansen? Never heard of him. Go on to YouTube. He carts and spins and dyes his own yarn. He knits and crochets the material and stretches it on stretcher bars. And so I said, oh, this is real interesting. Let me check him out. And then we're in Miami at Art Basel, and his work is featured at a major gallery on the wall, and all this engagement with his work through the whole week in Miami. And I said, yeah, people are interested in this material, but they're interested in it in a different form. Fag Ahmed. I love this story Fag Ahmed shared with me. When he was 7 years old, his parents left him in his bedroom to play on the rug, a family heirloom that belonged to his mother's grandmother, so his great-grandmother. And he was tracing patterns on the carpet, and he was looking at the patterns, tracing his finger from the center to the edge. Then he had a flash, and he fetched a pair of large scissors, and he cut up his grandmother's carpet. And it was, once he got started, it was hard to stop, and he cut the rug into more and more pieces and reassembled them and moved the pattern here and there. And then when his parents checked on him, the rug was unrecognizable. Soon after, rugs were removed from the home, and he was not allowed with the scissors. This man now is an internationally known artist from Baku, Azerbaijan. He represented Azerbaijan in the Venice Biennale of 2007, and he's well known for his conceptual works that utilize traditional craft and the visual language of carpets into a contemporary sculptural form. His works reimagine ancient crafts and create new visual boundaries by deconstructing traditions and stereotypes. Again, look at this engagement. We invited him to the Textile Museum last October, and it was standing room only in our multi-purpose space that we hold lectures. And the age diversity, race diversity, economic diversity, I had never seen at the Textile Museum before. And this is an installation. He's participating in a biennial now in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and his studio manager is Olga. So I follow Olga on Instagram, and she updates his followers. He doesn't participate in Instagram. Other people post his work, and he benefits from their engagement. Ernesto Neto, he defines himself as a sculptor. His works are designed to walk through. Jameson, there, okay, you see this? To be inhabited, to touch. He engages his viewers to touch the work and experience the work through their body and their senses. Visitors interact with each other as well with the surroundings and are immersed in a sculpture architecture fusion. He claims, what we have in common is more important than what makes us different. I'm interested in debating the plight of humanity, the temperature of things we experience, the movement of things and language. For this reason, he inquires into the common features of human relationships through sculpture that appeal to our sensuality and to our reflection. And this is another important to show people engaged with the work. This attracts young people's attention, that this is for me, that I can be a part of this, that I can engage with this. This is posted by the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, and this is Art Forum. And again, 3,500 people said, I like this. I'm digging this. And maybe they'll follow the hashtag and learn more about him and his work. Christine Forer, she weaves tapestries in wool, cotton, and linen, and I saw her work again in Miami. Her charged narratives conflate the epic and the intimate and psychological complexity. Her work's not easy to look at. She deals with difficult issues, and her work illustrates human pain, human anger, and suffering. She's based in Los Angeles. These are tapestries. She's represented by a major Chelsea gallery in New York. There is a shift happening. Lynette Suey, using discarded metal, aluminum, and creating these large cloths. These are from Jack Shaman Gallery. And again, this is not a matter of choice at this point, that you, in order to engage an audience, you have to be in this space. My niece is 30 years old, and she says, if you're not in social media, you're dead, you're gone. It's just, they're not interested. They want to see what their friends are looking at. Can we share this experience together? If I'm following the DIA, they might do previews of the show before it opens, hype it up, and so you have a ready-made audience when you open your doors to the galleries. Margot Wolowitz's work, she was born and raised in Dearborn, Michigan. She's right here. And her work references the visual trends in cyberspace, particularly those of social media, which she sees as conflicted systems that entangle the private with the political and the corporate. She hand weaves her panels using data sourced from the internet that she finds through hashtags, Google searches, and news feeds. In her woven work, she selects images and text, which she puts through a multi-step process of dye transfer onto polymer threads. She then weaves the threads on a traditional floor loom to create the panels, and she continues to dye and create or add paint through the weaving process. And let's go back to Brent Lawton. And so, when I go to Chelsea, I check down, who's showing this week so I can hit the galleries. And his work it's engaging, pulling an audience. This is his own account, so I'm following him directly. And this is the type of engagement he gets when he posts his own work on Instagram. He's a weaver. He's weaving, but he does not define himself as a weaver. He's a painter, and he creates woven paintings. Art Basel, Hong Kong. So these were featured in the Hong Kong by Art Basel, which happened maybe 3 weeks ago. I just find his work interesting. I find it, that he's upcycling materials and talking about the process of making them, but again, positioning himself in another space. And positioning himself in another space. And positioning himself in another space produces this: art auction results. That the engagement is driving media attention, and the engagement is driving collecting And this is something we need, you folks in the MFA program, you need to think about. Where do you position yourself in this art world? How do you define yourself? And my favorite, Iris. She's 95 years old, and she has a major following. 76,000 likes. Peace out, she says. The end.